Today on Morning Meditations, I'm going to talk about how God's mercy is never fair.
This is Morning Meditations with me, Pastor Ryan Hayden of Bible Baptist Church. To hear more or find out more about our church, visit BibleBaptistMattoon.org.
King Ahab was the worst. The Bible literally says that. 1 Kings 21 verses 25 and 26 says, "But there was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. And he did very abominably in following idols." Ahab was the worst king of Israel. In a long list of wicked kings, he distinguished himself as a first-round Hall of Famer. He set up Baal worship, he killed prophets. While his people were starving to death, he was out looking for food for his horses. In this very chapter, he stands by while his wife has his neighbor killed so he can take over his property for his garden. He was a terrible, no good, very bad king, which is why the rest of 1 Kings 21 is so interesting. You see, after Elijah confronted Ahab about his wickedness in taking the man's property, the Bible says, "And it came to pass, when Ahab heard those words, that he rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his flesh and fasted and lay in sackcloth and went softly." Ahab listened to the words of the preacher and repented. He humbled himself before God. And in the final two verses of chapter 21, God told Elijah, because Ahab humbled himself before God, that God wasn't going to bring the judgment that Ahab deserved, but delay that judgment until after Ahab died. In other words, Ahab humbled himself before God, and God showed mercy to Ahab. Now, when I first read that, I thought, this isn't fair. This guy? God, you're showing mercy to this guy? He's the worst. Don't you know who he is? Don't you know what he's done? And that's the lesson I want you to understand about God's mercy. God's mercy is never fair. Because if we deserved God's mercy, we wouldn't need God's mercy. If we deserved God's grace, we wouldn't need God's grace. You see, what God did to Ahab was show him unmerited mercy. Ahab deserved punishment, and God decided to show him mercy and not give him the punishment that he deserved. Now, that's not fair. Just as it's not fair when a judge looks at someone that definitely committed a heinous crime and lets him go. Mercy isn't fair. Look, if you knew me, you knew me like God knows me, you would know that I don't deserve God's mercy either. And if I really knew you, I knew you and I knew your thoughts and I knew your heart, I'd say that you don't deserve God's mercy. If we deserved God's mercy, we wouldn't need it. This is the very heart of the gospel. Jesus didn't die for a bunch of good, deserving people. He died for a bunch of people who didn't deserve it. Romans 5:6 says, "For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly." And then in verse 8 it says, "But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us." God's mercy isn't fair, and I'm grateful for that. Because if God's mercy was based on what I'd done rather than what Jesus did, I'd never qualify, and you wouldn't either.